Good evening. It's a very great pleasure to welcome you to this Just Share event. Just Share is a collaboration of churches and NGOs, particularly in the Diocese of London, but across London, seeking principally to provide a Christian examination of economic policies and products as they affect the developing world. That's why we're based here in the city. But we also seek to provide something of a school of Christian social and political thought, and this particular occasion fits into that series of lectures, so that the church, which often gets absorbed in other more transitory concerns, doesn't forget that there is an enormously vibrant and long tradition of social and political thought which emerges from the scriptures and from Christian doctrine. So we're offering that as a school to the church, and perhaps one should be unsurprised that not very many people want to come to school. But those who do come, of course, get particular bright gold and yellow stars. So you're all especially welcome tonight. David Grumett knows this tale. On the second day of Lent, I happened to go to a meeting of clergy, and coffee was provided, and then rather nervously, a large box of biscuits was put down in the middle, including some particularly delicious chocolate biscuits and some jammy Dodgers, which I can't normally resist. And there was a sort of nervous embarrassment. And, of course, so nervous were people that nobody actually dared to put their hand in, though everybody, of course, wanted to. But there did emerge from this a conversation about what Lent was about, a brief sort of relatively amusing conversation, which included from one priest the statement, the old-fashioned habit of fasting. The old-fashioned habit of fasting. And I was completely taken by this, because you might as well say that celebrating the Eucharist, or washing feet on Maundy Thursday, or reading the scriptures is old-fashioned, because of course fasting and particular habits about food for ordinary Christians, as well as those, of course, in the religious life, have been part of Christianity from the outset, and we can't get away from that. So to untangle some of those thoughts, and also particularly to put them into the context of Christian justice, we are delighted to have with us this evening Dr. David Grumett, who is very interested in the area of Christianity and food, and is a fellow in Christian ethics and practical theology at the University of Edinburgh. I think you've all got a note about him. But for our purposes, of course, it's the fact that he has written on the subject of material Eucharist, most recently, and also co-authored a book, Theology on the Menu, Asceticism, Meat, and Christian Diet. So all of that is completely on the point, and without further ado, I'll ask David to come and address us. David.
Well, thank you, George, for your extremely generous welcome. As the UK enters the Brexit negotiations, one of the factors in policymakers' minds is probably regulation. The notion there's too much regulation in society and that the EU is responsible for a lot of it has been a continuing thread of criticism during our membership. Why should someone in Brussels, so the argument goes, tell us Brits how many fish to catch, that our cucumbers must be straight, or that our bananas must be free from abnormal curvature? However, in Lent, we're reminded that regulation and discipline in general, particularly with regard to diet, are necessarily collective. They do have a place in our ongoing existence together. Farming, food production, and dining are social enterprises requiring cooperation between people and the recognition that the free decisions of some have impacts on others. In the later medieval and Reformation eras, state regulation of food consumption was well understood and socially accepted, and went far beyond anything that even Jean-Claude Juncker might wish for the EU. This began formally in 1336, when the size of meals was legally restricted to 2 courses, or 3 at a stretch on church festivals. This was followed 4 decades later, in 1363, by a regulation limiting grooms and servants to 1 dish of meat or fish per day, rather than more. So this introduced a class element into abstinence, and the idea that what one should be allowed to eat depended on social standing, and this continued and became widely accepted. We might suppose that church leaders led the way in self-denial and leaving more food for others. In fact, they didn't, and in Reformation England, things got so out of hand that the church hierarchy was subjected to special rules in order to try to restrain their dining. These stated that archbishops mustn't exceed 6 meat or fish dishes in a single sitting, bishops 5, and deans and archdeacons 4. These dishes would all have been placed on the table at once, this service à la française, the standard practice before the 19th century, when dishes began to be served à la Russe, that is, individually in a succession of courses, as we're familiar with today, unless we're eating tapas. Of second dishes, or desserts, archbishops were permitted 4, bishops 3, and deans and archdeacons 2. The regulations for the fish and game at clergy dining tables were particularly detailed. These stated that of the greater fishes or fowls there should be but 1 in a dish, as crane, swan, turkey-cock, haddock, pike, tench, and of less sorts but 2, viz. Capons 2, pheasants 2, conies 2, woodcocks 2. Of less sorts, as of partridges, the archbishop 3, the bishop and other degrees under him 2. Of blackbirds, the archbishop 6, the bishop 4, the other degrees 3, of larks and snipes, and of that sort but 12. The constitution continued that whatsoever is spared by the cutting off of the old superfluity should yet be provided and spent in plain meats for the relieving of the poor. Appended to the minute, however, is a note that this order was kept for 2 or 3 months, till by the disusing of certain willful persons, it came to the old excess. I should add, before I continue, there's no mention in these records of the rations allocated to the rector of St. Mary le Bow. I'm sure there was no need for particular rules in place, because frugality has always been a virtue here. The instruction that the money saved by limiting consumption be spent in plain meats for the relieving of the poor is striking. Control of food intake wasn't promoted just for personal health benefits, nor even to improve one's spiritual standing before God, but because it freed up resources for those who didn't have enough. In today's secular times, understanding these social and economic motivations for abstinence is vital. Many aren't any longer likely to abstain because they believe God requires this of them. Personal health and spirituality are more prominent motives now, but can, like the competitive abstinence of desert hermits, become self-indulgent and lose sight of the wider context. For example, almonds are loved as a carb and grain substitute in pastry, but consider the 1 trillion gallons of water needed each year to irrigate the orchards in California, where most of the world's almond supply comes from. I'll now turn to two monastic rules to examine in more detail the social and economic dimensions of abstinence. First, to the social dimension and the notion of choice within boundaries. This was enshrined in the rule of Benedict, which was compiled around the year 540 and became the major monastic rule in Western Christendom. In chapter 39 on the measure of food, Benedict writes, "We believe it to be sufficient for the daily meal that every table should have 2 cooked dishes on account of individual infirmities, so that he who perchance cannot eat of the one may make his meal of the other. Therefore let 2 cooked dishes suffice for all the brethren, and if any fruit or young vegetables are available, let a 3rd be added. Bread was permitted in addition, as much as a good pound weight daily, with this allowance made to stretch to include supper. The abbot was allowed to increase the rations of monks engaged in heavy work." Benedict wished to promote a level of eating that was sustainable long-term rather than just for a season, and one that worked in a community. Hence his command that, in principle, the life of a monk ought at all times to be Lenten in its character. In the desert, he'd witnessed firsthand the competitions between monks over who could eat the least, and foresaw the obvious disruption such rivalry would cause within community. This is why it was essential for Benedict that all abstinence and self-denial be with the abbot's approval. The abbot, a bit like the invisible hand of classical economic theory, could reconcile the community's material and spiritual needs and maintain harmony. In short, then, abstinence in moderation was viewed as socially good, being part of responsible and mutually accountable community living. Now to the economics of early Christian abstinence. The dietary choices of large numbers of monks living together in one place could evidently make a significant impact on the region's economy. A large community could potentially obtain exotic foods or foods of a higher quality from further afield than individual families, and could stockpile food for its members during a famine. In this early monastic period, however, because of their strict discipline, monks living in a community probably enjoyed a dietary standard no higher than that of the surrounding populace. They lived in a condition of practice-based solidarity with their locality and region, which was grounded in a higher level of abstention than that necessitated by their existence as a large community. This is echoed by Basil of Caesarea. In his earlier rule, which was compiled around 350, Basil promotes a simple diet and relates this simplicity to the place where the community is located. He writes, "We ought to choose for our own use whatever is more easily and cheaply obtained in each locality and available for common use, and bring in from a distance only those things which are more necessary for life, such as oil and the like, or if something is appropriate for the necessary relief of the sick, yet even this only if it can be obtained without fuss and disturbance and distraction." Basil's community followed a moderate diet rather than observing continual, rigorous fasting. Of particular interest is how Basil situates the eating practices of specific communities. What constitutes a moderate diet isn't prescribed once and for all, but is discerned in each location in a way that acknowledges the reciprocal relationship between the ascetic community and its wider social, economic, and geographical contexts. So much for clergy and monasteries, one might say, but how, if at all, do their disciplines translate into wider society? To begin to answer this, I'll look at how Basil himself describes the social justice implications of abstinence, then examine Lenten abstinence in wider society. Basil refers to the social transformation that fasting brings about as a result of the solidarity between monastery and surrounding society, as the concrete effects of the choices made in monastic communities spread through their wider community. He emphasizes the transformative power of asceticism. In fasting, he says, the whole city generally and all its people are brought together in well-altered harmony, raucous voices put to rest, strife banished, insults hushed. He depicts the changes that fasting brings not only to individual persons but to the whole city. Through the solidarity deriving from Christian practice, social space is itself redeemed. Fasting, Basil states, preserves health, keeps husbands faithful, sustains marriages, prevents bloodshed, quietens cooks and servants, limits debt and reduces crime. Basil thus argues that fasting brings harmony to society. How does this work? He would have been well aware of the early Christian tradition that gluttony, not lust, was the first of the 7 deadly sins, from which the other 6 followed. However, it would be simplistic to read his text as founded on scientific claims about the biological effects of moderate diet in influencing behavior, or as a theologically determined representation of the monastery as the guarantor of earthly harmony. Rather, he's alert to the real-life social, economic, and political impacts of gluttony. Conflicts around access to water to irrigate crops, land ownership boundaries, harvesting and gleaning entitlements, and rights to source exotic ingredients, as well as to the credit for them, might lead to social and even political conflict. Within households, servants and staff would no longer view their masters eating extravagantly if the masters were abstaining, and the eyes of the latter wouldn't be roving for superior fare elsewhere. Let me now fast forward to a general overview of the patterns of fasts in Britain around the time of the Reformation. If you'd been living 500 years ago, what dietary abstinence would the state have required of you and when? And how was this linked to social justice? The main season of abstinence, and the most ancient, was Lent, the season we're currently in, which lasted, as now, over 6 weeks. No red meat, dairy products, or eggs could be eaten during this entire period, although fish was always permitted, and from the time of King Henry VIII, dairy products and eggs too. The serious consequences of breaking a fast were stated in King Edward VI's first proclamation for the abstaining from flesh in the Lent time of 1547, which warned, "Whosoever shall upon any day heretofore wont to be fasted from flesh, eat flesh contrary to this proclamation, shall incur the king's high indignation, and shall suffer imprisonment, and be otherwise grievously punished at his majesty's will and pleasure." A few weeks before the start of Lent each year, a similar royal proclamation was issued, reminding the populace that abstinence wasn't a matter of personal choice. The second fasting season was Advent, which, as we know, is the period leading up to Christmas. The word means coming, and fasting during this season heightened the sense of waiting and expectation that would be realized in the Christmas celebration of Christ's birth in the animals' feeding trough at Bethlehem. Also notable were the 12 Ember Days, which comprised the Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays following the Feast of St. Lucy, the first Sunday in Lent, the Feast of Pentecost, and Holy Cross Day. Abstinence from red meat was also required on every Wednesday, which was identified as the day when Judas Iscariot began to betray Jesus, every Friday, the day of the crucifixion of Jesus, and every Saturday, the day when Jesus lay in the tomb, unless a feast fell on one of these days. Fasting was also prescribed for the eves of various feasts and festivals. As late as the 1662 Book of Common Prayer, these are listed as the vigils of Christmas, the Purification of Mary, the Annunciation, Easter Day, Ascension Day, Pentecost, St. Matthias, St. John the Baptist, St. Peter and St. Paul, St. James, St. Bartholomew, St. Matthias, St. Simon and Jude, St. Andrew, St. Thomas, and all saints. Thus, even allowing for some double counting, well over half the days of the year were classed as fast days, and meat couldn't be eaten on any of them. At the Reformation, the political importance of maintaining and even strengthening the Lenten abstinence from red meat is articulated in an important passage from the Homily of Fasting, from the second book of homilies. These homilies were legally appointed to be read in rotation in churches, and their official status as Church of England teaching is defined as an article of religion. The homily particularly encourages meat abstinence by the well-supplied and wealthy, on the grounds that it leaves more food from the land's fair pastures, as it puts it, for others at cheaper prices, in order that the increase of victuals upon the land may the better be spared and cherished, to the sooner reducing of victuals to a more moderate price, to the better sustenance of the poor. Wealthy people would clearly experience the most restrictions during a fast because, under normal circumstances, they would enjoy easier access to the foods prohibited. Furthermore, a striking argument is made linking the preservation of fish days with civil defense and economic security. Fasting isn't associated with weakness, but with strength, virility, and territorial integrity in the face of aggression by the hostile Spanish Empire and its flotilla. In the Elizabethan context of a sceptred isle environed with the sea, fish days helped ensure the wages of fishermen were paid. Moreover, increased fish eating arrested the decay of the towns nigh the seas, as the homily puts it, strengthening the local economies of coastal ports, which were essential for the naval defense of the realm. Despite these various public benefits, a breakdown in fasting disciplines during the following decades contributed to food shortages amongst the poor. Archbishop Whitgift's admonition for preachers of 1596 urged that housekeepers being of wealth would be content in their own diet to avoid excess, and to use fewer dishes of meat in this time of dearth, and to forbear to have suppers in their houses on Wednesdays, Fridays, and fasting days, whereby much might be spared that would be better bestowed a great deal on the relief of the poor. Whitgift here seeks to restrict food consumption by spiritual exhortation. This suggests civil legislation wasn't seen as the sole means of dietary control, and that the function of preaching wasn't simply to justify such legislation. Spiritual considerations continued to be an important ingredient alongside legal requirements. The final proclamation of fasting in England was made by King Charles II in 1664, and the final prosecutions for infringements also occurred this decade. The statute for fish days was eventually repealed in 1856 on grounds of disuse. Although various national days of fasting and humiliation were proclaimed during the 19th century, such as for deliverance from cholera, these were optional rather than legally mandated. They mainly provided opportunities for political exhortation, whereas the nationally observed Lenten fast had constituted a serious, extended time of collective self-denial in society. If a monastic community in 4th century Cappadocia or early modern England under its godly sovereign were vulnerable to corruption by its members exploiting economies of scale, how much more is this true today in a nationally and globally interconnected capitalist system of food production, distribution, and consumption, finely regulated not by a written text, but by the endlessly circulating flows of information about supply and demand, to which suppliers and consumers respond through the price mechanism. Modern society has honed consumption to a fine art, and the ultimate consumer good is quite possibly food. Food has, by definition, no purpose in human culture except to be eaten. The food type around which there's currently greatest concern is meat, with high levels of global livestock making a large contribution to global warming. Livestock production generates a higher proportion of the world's greenhouse gases at 18% than motor transport at 13%. Livestock produce high proportions of the total global volume of noxious gases. These include 35 to 40% of methane, which is 23 times more effective at trapping heat and thereby causing global warming than carbon dioxide, and 64% of nitrous oxide, which is 296 times more effective at trapping heat. 13 million hectares of forest are cleared annually to provide land for grazing or feed crops, reducing global carbon storage capacity and destroying soil structure, which leads to desertification. Vast quantities of existing crops are fed to livestock rather than to malnourished humans, thereby perpetuating ecological decline. Importantly, the effects of global warming are felt disproportionately by the agricultural sector, which in a global food economy is staffed by many of the world's poorest. Moreover, these people are least able to relocate when their homes are threatened by rising sea levels. As well as working as employees in the global food business, they need to grow food for themselves. Moreover, famine and water shortages may perpetuate armed conflict. Many would probably be more receptive to a call to some other form of ecological responsibility, such as reducing car use, even though the first chapter of Ezekiel seems to present God driving something like a Land Rover. Reducing car use appeals to vague Christian notions of fostering stable local community and interacting with others while journeying on public or other shared transport. It isn't, of course, something we shouldn't be doing. However, there are other things we also need to be doing in the area of diet and ecology, such as reducing meat consumption. Despite this, exhortations to do so can cause discomfort. By challenging meat's cultural domination, they subvert a whole system of economic, social, cultural, and gender relations, the financial and advertising power of the meat industry, family dining around a common table with common food, the notion that meat is manly and its provision to men a natural ministry of devotion by women, views of meat eating as normal and vegetarianism as an eccentric, faddish pose. In a challenging mission context, when churches and clergy are desperately trying to appeal to the unchurched and de-churched, this countercultural message might well seem a step too far, distracting from the core gospel message of saving souls. Meat production also requires the control of land, whether for grazing or for growing feed crops or both. This is pertinent in the British context, when the enclosure of open common land into small, individually owned plots impeded the grazing of animals by peasants and effectively expelled them from their own land, unless perhaps they could pay to keep it. Beef, which is the most costly meat in terms of the quantity of vegetable protein required to produce it, thus became the defining feature of the table of the landed yeomanry in the 18th century. A peasant family wouldn't have had sufficient land of their own to graze even one heifer or steer after enclosure. British beef therefore came to represent a comfortable, domesticated, male-dominated social superiority to which in time many would aspire, retaining these class associations until the late 19th century. This nexus of control over animals, land, and other people was perfectly expressed in the ritual of the male head of the household carving the hunk of flesh in the center of the table, surrounded by his wife and family, a scene that Mrs. Beeton revealingly expected to provoke envy in others. During the 20th century, a similar development may be traced in the United States, with meat eating becoming a sign of success among wealthier working-class men and their families, 3 times a day, including steak for breakfast. The rule of Benedict restricted the consumption of red meat, which it classified as the flesh of 4-footed animals, to the sick, the elderly, and children. Meat eating, especially in excess, was a sign of weakness, with meat viewed as a food that strong, fit, and healthy adults didn't need. Applying this principle today, we might say that the finite supply of meat should be directed towards those who really need it, such as the very young and the weak. At the least, global production systems shouldn't result in meat being exported from regions of the world where there's genuine need into countries such as the UK, which has more than enough internal productive capacity. Let me now return to Lenten abstinence and to some of the biblical inspiration for controlling our diet. Today, abstaining during Lent is frequently related to the fast of Christ in the wilderness. This association has been encouraged by the ancient collect for the first Sunday in Lent, addressing Christ, who did for our sake fast 40 days and 40 nights, against the temptation of political power, among other temptations. Yet historically, associations were drawn with a whole host of charismatic figures from both testaments, all of whom in some way or other represent or acknowledge the imperatives of political, social, or economic justice. Moses, who did fast for 40 days and nights, did so on Mount Sinai while receiving the commandments of divine justice in both written and spoken forms, pleading for the forgiveness of his people whom he'd led out of slavery in Egypt as they waited below. King Ahab fasted in sackcloth after Elijah prophesied his death and the passing of the kingdom of Israel from him, after he and his wife Jezebel had Naboth unjustly killed in order to seize his vineyard. David, the lowly shepherd, but the Lord's anointed, fasted in the wilderness when fleeing the evil King Saul. The pious King Hezekiah of Judah fasted in the temple after his kingdom was overrun by the brutal Assyrians and its property, including even the gold from its temple doors, was expropriated. Anna fasted continually in the temple following decades of widowhood, waiting for the redemption of Jerusalem. John the Baptist ate locusts, or maybe plant roots, we're not now sure about the normal translation of this, as well as wild honey in the desert, calling his society to repentance and urging them to prepare for what lay ahead. Paul, when speaking out against both religious and civil powers for the sake of Christ, fasted anxiously when traveling and while in hiding. Moreover, the whole people of Israel fasted together when fleeing Egyptian persecution in the desert. So Scripture presents many examples of the political and social power of abstinence. What does biblical, monastic, and wider social abstinence in the Reformation era teach us about abstinence today? Above all, it helps us begin to see what a non-consumerist social and ecological context might look like. To the consumerist mind, items are available for consumption unless specifically prohibited for good reason. But the matter could be viewed very differently. Many of the Mosaic food rules, such as avoiding pork and shellfish and not mixing together meat and dairy, are difficult to justify rationally, although many have tried to do so. It doesn't follow from this, however, that such rules should be ignored. Rather, it perhaps shows that a biblical approach to food and dining places a greater burden on consumers to justify their consumption of particular foods, especially meat, than is normal in a consumer society. In ancient Israel, exclusions weren't regarded as exceptions to a rule of general availability that required an overpoweringly convincing justification. Rather, if the range of foods regarded as clean and consumable was sufficient to provide the population with the food it needed, there was no need to define the category of acceptable foods more widely. It's possible that the context of global warming will become so dominant that more radical interpretations of scripture and tradition than are usual today will become widespread and even standard. In this case, humankind will come to relearn the basic truths that strict limitation, including some complete exclusions, are a normal and necessary part of social functioning. This is certainly true in historical perspective. What's unusual about modern Western society, especially its attitude to meat, isn't that reductions in consumption are now being mooted, but that consumption isn't already strictly controlled by systems of cleanliness, taboo, law, or social ostracism. One central area to which Christians might look is their worship. In practice, how might Christian worship contest social and economic commodification? The Christian theology of sacramentality may be viewed as somewhat debased, given it's become so focused in the Eucharist on exactly the kind of link between participation and consumption on which the pathologies of consumer society are based. It's important to understand that only in the relatively recent past has receiving the bread and wine at every Eucharist become normal in the Anglican Church, and receiving the bread at every Eucharist has become normal for people in the Roman Catholic Church. Until a few decades ago, these would have been received but maybe a couple of times a year, or might have been received at other times than during the Eucharist itself. So we've all grown up really with a link between participation and consumption in the Eucharist that previous generations just didn't see, although we probably take this completely for granted. However, drawing on the Ignatian idea of seeing God in all things, Vincent Miller proposes an alternative model of sacramentality grounded not in consumption, but in a belief that the divine is present or potentially present in a wide range of objects that might otherwise be commodified as consumer goods. Miller writes, "Sacramentality is an interesting example of a religious resource for countering consumer culture, because it challenges consumer culture not by critiquing consumption, but by questioning the abstracting dynamics of commodification itself. Sacramentality," Miller continues, "might provide the cultural basis for an oppositional sensibility founded on the recognition of the particularity of all objects. Just as in the Eucharist, Christ is substantially present in this bread and this wine, so other objects normally regarded as mere consumables may be viewed as analogously particular and permanent." Of course, when we receive the bread and wine in the Eucharist, there's a sense that we do spiritually receive Christ's body and blood, but there's a very correct and proper sense that we are not consuming them too. We are not, after all, cannibals transported back in time. Nevertheless, we Christians may also need to pay greater attention to the practicalities of our own liturgical practice and wide reliance on the modern altar bread market. In recent decades, the spread of lay communion in the Roman Catholic Church, the rise of the Anglican parish communion movement, and the rebirth of Eucharistic observance within Lutheranism have together produced an explosion in demand for altar breads. Yet over 4/5 of the breads used by churches in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia are now manufactured by a single company based in the eastern United States, Kavanaugh. A highly automated, patent-protected process is employed that uses a secret flour blend, a sealed edge to avoid crumbs, trademarked imprints, and wheat supplied by agribusiness. Until the Second World War, however, parishes relied on convents for altar breads. They were produced by labouring in hot kitchens, cutting out wafers individually and baking them on sheets. Yet during the 2 decades following the end of the war, the number of convents and nuns began to decline at the same time as the demand for wafers massively increased. A market thereby came into being with demand that a large company could meet, and indeed has effectively monopolized. Because of the economies of scale available to this large company, many convents have found it difficult to compete, becoming distributors of Kavanaugh altar breads rather than producing their own. They've thereby maintained a bond with the parishes for which they formerly baked, as well as gaining some income, without needing to operate a staff and a full production facility. Sister Lynn, from the remaining convent that produces more altar breads than any other, describes the work of actual production and baking as an extension of our Eucharistic charism, which includes prayer and the litany of parishes repeated as the breads are packed ready for dispatch. This is in marked contrast with their secular competitor, which employs a fully automated process that leaves its hosts, as its marketing material proudly proclaims, untouched by human hands. Perhaps in the Eucharist, we Christians need to reattune ourselves to the context of displacement and the fight for social justice given by the standard greeting used by the priest during the liturgy, "The Lord be with you." In the Eucharist, this may be used as the opening greeting before the collect, before the reading of the Gospel, at the beginning of the Eucharistic prayer, and before the final blessing, so as many as 5 times. These are the words with which Boaz salutes Ruth and her mother-in-law Naomi as the women enter the fields to glean behind the harvesters. The story of the impoverished migrant Ruth begins in a barley harvest, with the Moabite woman's lowly status highlighted by her gleaning of this particular grain. As today, barley was considered inferior to wheat, worth about half the price per measure. With a lower gluten content, it rises less well and is usually seen as tasting less good and as harder to digest. However, barley tolerates harsher conditions, has a shorter growing season, and so needs less water. It survives at the margins of cultivable land, in areas where wheat is unlikely to grow. Wheaten flour has classically been used for the Eucharistic bread because it produces bread that's generally regarded as higher quality. We can even go back to someone like Thomas Aquinas many centuries ago, saying we should use wheaten bread. Nevertheless, reattuning ourselves to forgotten associations in our liturgy, in our scripture, and in our history as a church and as a Christian society, where fasting and abstinence have historically been collective and legally required, may nurture a deeper commitment to social justice and help us think this through in distinctively Christian terms. For instance, calling to mind and being aware of the fact that a conversation between an impoverished, hungry woman migrant actually helps structure our Eucharistic exchanges. This may reawaken our imaginations, our minds, and our prayers. Such a renewal has the potential to help churches reconnect with secularized publics who are often greatly concerned about food justice, but wrongly think that the Christian gospel and tradition have little to say about it. These are not simply matters for New Age spirituality or Islam or Judaism or secular social movements. Food and social justice linked with it are concerns that Christians should have uppermost today and be communicating to each other and to the wider world why and how this is important to them. Thank you.
How's that being recorded? David, thank you very much. That was a magnificently compendious survey of material. It raised all sorts of hermeneutical issues for how we look at the tradition and convert it to our present day, and it was not lacking in a certain amount of opinion, which always makes for a happy event. So there's now an opportunity of perhaps 10 or 15 minutes before we have some refreshments for some questions and responses, and then after we've had a brief time of refreshments, if people do want a further sort of informal conversation, we can facilitate that briefly. So people need to feel free to go whenever they want to from now onwards, really. So don't think that we'll be concerned if you need to be away. So any questions? Sir? Now you're going to get a microphone, and the important thing is to speak into the microphone quite close to your mouth. Otherwise it doesn't pick up the...
Good evening. Thank you very much for a very comprehensive study. I'm wondering, though, about the effects of winter. So if we're coming up to Lent in, let's say, 1670, and there's...
So I didn't hear the key word, the effects
Lent.
of...
Lent.
Winter.
Winter, yes.
So what were the constraints which were placed on people in practical applications of eating? You've starved all winter and you want to get some food in your stomach.
Sure.
How much can you survive if you then have 40 days of Lent?
Yes. So the question relates to how far Lent, which is usually pretty much in winter, this year it's somewhat in spring, how really could people cope with a hard winter with low food supplies when they were also constrained to abstinence?
Yes, this is a fascinating question, and so thank you for raising it. Perhaps I could come at it in a slightly oblique way by suggesting that we think about sort of food supplies. Clearly, food was not as plentiful in former centuries as it is today in a country like the United Kingdom for so many of us. When Lent first got going in the Middle East, extremes of climate and sort of through the seasons of the year were not as much as they are somewhere like the UK, where we have a strong sense of seasonality. So as Lent sort of migrated northwards and westwards, it moved from a context where each day was sort of pretty much the same in terms of climate into one where there were sort of extremes of hot and cold, dry and wet, depending on the time of year. Now, it seems that Lent actually made seasonal sense, despite the way we might think otherwise today, because it discouraged people from eating their remaining food supplies too quickly during the early period of the year, so sort of February, March, April, while supplies were likely to be scarce. So it encouraged people in particular not to kill animals that they might need for ploughing or for dairy products, or to conserve, so that they sort of gave birth to young in due course. So it seems to me, and I've thought about this a lot, that the liturgical and theological idea of Lent has had such powerful continuity with us, because it kind of mapped on to a seasonal logic of scarcity and abundance. And when Easter came, obviously the time of feasting, that was the time, sort of like now, when we see more food becoming available, animals are giving birth to young, and so on. So I wouldn't want to suggest that Lent was an easy time for anyone, but yes, that's a really perceptive point. I hope I've given a useful reply.
Most helpful. I think that's interesting. Any other questions? Passing the microphone forward. Thank you.
How do we do
Closer to your mouth.
How do we do fasting wisely today when foods that seem to be permitted, like almonds, as you mentioned, are actually hugely problematic?
So how do we do fasting today when something like almonds, which are fantastically good for you, they're a sort of miracle food, but they seem to be somewhat problematic in terms of their production? I'm devoted to the almond.
Yes, I enjoy almond as a flour substitute too, powdered almond. This is a really challenging question, I think, for someone like me, who's very much immersed in the Christian tradition, and this, as we're well aware, is a question that has only emerged pretty recently. I guess we need to educate ourselves into the true ecological and social costs of the food we eat, and be aware that these might cross assumed boundaries of luxury and sort of normality. So, for instance, almonds maybe we should view as being as luxurious as a beef steak, but this requires a very different mindset to the one that we are presented with in Scripture, where it seems that fruits and vegetables and grains are pretty unproblematically available to us. I guess one could even say the same thing about fish. I love eating fish, and I'm happy that there is strong biblical endorsement for that. The majority of the apostles, it seems, were fishermen, and one could even go so far as to say that small fishing businesses sustained the spread of the gospel. But yes, with issues around overfishing today, do actually Christians like me need to reconsider their attitude to fish eating too?
I think actually what you raise is a very interesting point about how we deal with the modern world and the Scriptures. So the big things that are kind of issues of debate in the Church of England and have been for the last few decades have been issues to do with sexuality and the inclusion of women in ministry. And you can, from the Scriptures, absolutely firmly prove a conservative position on both those issues. And it seems to me that one of when those two things are settled, don't hold your breath over either of them, but when they're settled, the church is going to have a row about something else. And I think it will be about the eating of meat. And the hermeneutic issue will be pretty much the same, because we can prove that Jesus actually ate meat. We know that he did, and that there's an abundance of meat in various parts of the scriptures, but that isn't necessarily what Christians ought to be doing today for other very good reasons. So I think we're going to have a splendid row. We'll have pescatarian dioceses and vegetarian parishes, and there'll be meat-eating provinces, and we'll all have a fantastic row.
Maybe one further response I could give to your question, and George's comments have sort of brought that into my mind. Perhaps one helpful way of thinking about this is to draw on some of the ideas presented by Paul in his letter to the Romans and first letter to the Corinthians, where when he's dealing with issues around what foods may be eaten at a shared table, he seems to develop what we might term an other regarding ethic. So in other words, it's not primarily about my purity and preferences. It's about how my wishes and my beliefs about what is right impact on other people within the church, people coming to faith, and people looking at the church from outside. So it's partly to do with how others see us. But by saying that, I wouldn't want to sort of pull us away from the kind of rigorous scientific engagement we need. In another role, I'm quite heavily involved in farm animal welfare. And since I've got into this, I've really realized that really to start formulating coherent ethical positions on any practical issue, we just need to do a lot of learning and understanding of how things work and sort of how much water it takes to produce a bag of powdered almonds, for instance. So yes, there's an element of how our views impact on others, but yes, how deeply grounded are they, a good food image, in actual reality, and knowing about that.
Anything else that people have? Oh, yes, pass that along if you would. That's very, very kind. Thank you. Very close to your mouth, if you would.
You mentioned, couldn't quite get the name, somebody called Miller, and you were talking about the Eucharist, and you were talking about commodification and consumption, and you said it could be transferred into other objects. What did you mean by that?
Well, it's a slightly sort of counterintuitive point I was trying to make, I think. Christian thought about food, we might say, well, the Eucharist is a great resource for this because we have an instance of sort of food and communal dining at the center of what Christians do together. But I wonder, first of all, whether the fact we have the Eucharist in Christian tradition sometimes encourages us to sort of pull food out of a practical everyday context too quickly and sort of theologize it. Do we perhaps need to spend more time thinking about food in an everyday context, as maybe happens in other religions? But I suppose, sort of building on that, I was thinking, well, is it actually necessary for every Eucharist to be an occasion on which the high point for its participants is consumption? I'm not wanting to criticize the very, very positive development in sort of participation in the Eucharist by laity that recent decades have seen. But if one just tries to think oneself back into a situation where one was present at the Eucharist, but only the priest received, or very few people received, that would be a different experience, and it wouldn't be focused on consumption in the same way. So Perhaps the way forward is for us not actually to stop receiving the communion when we're at the Eucharist, but actually try to think, well, what else is this about apart from consumption, maybe?
Well, I think my answer to that would be that certainly for me, it functions as a sacrament of sharing. And so I think the fact that it's a shared meal is fundamental rather than it being consumed. I would be very nervous about not sharing a cup, because for me that seems to me to express something much more as significant as consumption. But you didn't ask me the question, but I've given my answer. One final comment or question, if people would care to, or shall we break? One final comment. Thank you very much. We'll just need to pass that across to you. And if you could put that very close to your mouth, and then we'll break for refreshments.
It's not really a question, it's a comment. I now worship at a Methodist church, but I was brought up in a Presbyterian church, which then became URC. And the whole notion of communion is totally different. This was an Anglican way of looking at it.
Yes.
And I mean, the Methodist way that we usually do it as well, I don't like, because you sort of traipse forward and kneel down and have this bit of bread. Whereas in the more the congregational style, you pass it from person to person, and it's much more feeling of shared than this personal thing that happens in the Anglican one. I'm just advertising as a better way of doing it, really.
Yes, I do know some Anglican churches where maybe with a smaller number of people gathered together, it is passed around in a circle. But I think probably in Anglican churches, there's less of a tendency to do that for a large number of people, because it can be more complicated. You do that, do you? Yes. As you know, in Scotland, where my academic position is, the Presbyterian Church is very much still going, although not quite with the numbers it did have a few decades ago. And there, as I understand it, the typical practice is that the communion will be brought down by the elders to people in the pews. So there is more of a sense there of it being taken out rather than the people coming up.
I think one of your most telling things, which I keep on meaning to do something about, was about the monopolization of wafer bread. And I think in some of the traditions you mentioned, it won't be wafer bread, it'll just be bread. And that would solve a problem. But the monopolization of that, and of course, one can, of course, set against that the fact that there is now an extremely good provider of fair trade communion wine, which is taking the Church of England by storm. And there's no reason why people can't use that, and by using that wine can guarantee an income to producers in the developing world. So you can balance these things, but I need to do something about the wafer breads here.
The question of what bread we use in worship is a very interesting one. Some of you may be aware that in Eastern Orthodox churches, risen bread that looks really like a bread roll is the norm, and this has been strongly defended for theological reasons. The rising of the bread has been associated, for example, with the presence of the Holy Spirit in the Eucharist, which is very important in the Orthodox tradition, whereas historically some Orthodox critics have said, well, using unleavened bread, i.e. flat wafer bread, suggests that this is somehow a dead body rather than a living body. It's also making me think of a church I was pastoral assistant in Paris, where the communion wine that was used, because it wasn't fortified, often went sour. And when we changed this and started using fortified wine, someone in the congregation actually had problems with this, because she said, well, the wine is no longer sour, And for her, the sourness
Oh, yes.
was part of bringing into her mind the suffering of Christ. So actually, the kind of bread we have, the kind of wine we have, is sort of theologically significant, perhaps at a subconscious level as much as at a fully rationally worked out level.
Well, I'm sure you'll all agree with me that we have had an absolutely fascinating lecture, a real tour de force delivered with great authority and covering a vast range of the tradition. Your lecture will, I think, be available on our website so that people can go back and find out all those details about archdeacons in the 1400s and what they ate. We might just edit the bit out about the rector of St Mary Le Bow, just for. But we're really much in your debt. That's a wonderful lecture, and one I hope that many others are going to have the privilege of hearing in other places over time, because you've addressed something that I think we are ignoring at our peril. So thank you very much indeed.